So good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today as a part of the Alumni Mentor Program Spring Webinar Series. Today's program will be a little bit more interactive and will focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion and unconscious bias for you as mentors. And it's going to be led by Charlian Jeffries, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Division of Development and Alumni Relations at Penn State. So with that, I will let Charlian as our expert to introduce herself and get us started today.
Those are some big shoes to fill when the word expert gets thrown out, right? So let me see if I can live out to that. But thanks so much for that introduction. Yes, my name is Charlian Jeffries. I am, as Lauren shared, the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for our Division of Development and Alumni Relations. April will be 19 years since I started working at Penn State in some capacity in the DE&I field throughout the course of those 19 years, and am really excited to share some of what I've learned in those spaces, but also how we then move that into how we engage with folks. And so the hope this afternoon is to really kind of focus in on the role implicit bias plays in how we form relationships, and most importantly, how do we mitigate its influence? So we'll do some interactive things, just a couple of kind of platform things. Feel free, if you have questions, to come off mute and ask those. I don't want this to be a lecture. I really do enjoy engaging. If I say something that you're like, yeah, that doesn't really resonate for me, or I'm not sure that I see things the same way, what's really the benefit and the driver behind issues or initiatives like diversity, equity, and inclusion is fostering spaces where those differing experiences and viewpoints come together for us to build a broader, more holistic understanding of the way in which we all come and work together. So feel free to come off mute. You can also throw things in chat. I'll do my best to monitor that. I am working between a number of different screens, so you might see my head turned to the side looking at some stuff, but I'll do my best to stay focused here. So very shortly, I am going to share a PowerPoint that I'll use to kind of guide our discussion. I do want to invite you to grab a pen and paper, something you can write with. We are going to do an activity kind of very shortly into the presentation that's got you jotting down a couple of things and thinking through some different experiences that you have. And then I'm also going to use a platform called Mentimeter. If you're familiar with things like Poll Everywhere or Kahoot or some of these other kind of online polling platforms, Mentimeter is very much similar to that. And so if you have another browser window, or if you're watching on an iPad and you have a phone available, just something where you can access that while listening to the presentation. So that being said, we'll jump right in and start talking about what's often referred to as the hidden bias of good people. And let me just do a quick check and make sure that folks are actually seeing the screen here. Thanks, Lauren. It's an image of kind of two heads facing in opposite directions with some puzzle pieces overlapping, right? So the authors of and scholars behind the scientific study of implicit bias wrote their book called Blind Spot, The Hidden Bias of Good People, right? And so this is looking at the ways in which all of us, most of the time, are really intending to do good, right, and to treat people with fairness and kindness and openness. But there might be some things that get in our way of doing that we're not even attentive to. And so implicit bias is an attempt to identify that phenomena and then start to be able to mitigate it, right? Put practices and measures in place to reduce its impact. So what we'll look at is just the basic definition, right? So some folks are probably really familiar with this phenomena, and for others, this might be somewhat new. So I will, No, I said both, right? Some are really familiar and for some it's new. Okay. Yeah, covered the spans there. But I'll try to get us all starting from kind of the same definitional standpoint. And then we'll do these things that really do kind of show or demonstrate how implicit bias can show up. So let's talk about this invisible structure, right? The things that are happening in our brain that we're not always tapped into. And where does that come from, right? So what I want you to do is take a quick moment and I want you to jot down the names. This is where the pen and paper kind of comes into play. Jot down the names of 10 people that you trust, right? 10 people that are close to you that you trust that are not biologically related to you. Okay, they can be family members through relationship other than kind of biological. They can be coworkers, past or present. They can be neighbors, friends. You know, who are those folks that you consider in your inner circle? If you're like me, maybe you don't get to 10, right? Like my circle is small. There's a core group of folks that I really consider that inner circle. But if you get to 7, get to 5, either way, try to come up with that list of people that you would consider to be in your inner circle of trust. Okay, while you're thinking through that, I'm going to move us to the next kind of process with this. Now that you have this list, I want to start doing some comparisons of these individuals, right? So I'm going to put up some demographic identifiers, right? Things where we usually fill out or check boxes about who we are or how people have tried to classify us. And I'm going to ask you to think about these people in terms of those demographic identifiers. And where you are similar to that person, I want you to put a mark. It can be a check, it can be an X mark, whatever it is, but where you're similar to those individuals, right? And so maybe you're doing a tick mark for kind of every category. When you get to 5, right, you kind of do the slash to kind of count up how many similarities. But so here's what those identifiers are. Are you similar to this person in age, right? Maybe 5 to 7 years of an age difference between you and the individual that you're looking at. Do you share the same racial background, right? And here, again, we're talking for most of these social constructs of what we mean by race. Do you have the same religious background, right? If you don't know, you can put a question mark or you can leave that blank. Do you share the same gender or the same gender identity? When we talk about sexual identity, we're talking about the different types of attraction, right? That span from asexual folks who really don't experience sexual attraction to pansexual folks who are attracted to a variety of different individuals, not necessarily based on kind of any gender identity, right? Most folks tend to think of sexual identity in a very binary, gay or straight, but it's much more expansive than that. Do you share the same language of origin, right? Is your first language the same language that either is the same first language as that other individual, or that other individual is fluent in communicating in? What about ability status, right? And ability status is both the visible and invisible, so you might not know. But here's where we're talking about physical abilities or disabilities, psychological or intellectual. What about political ideology, right? Are you on the same side of the spectrum or in similar places across the spectrum of political ideologies? And then when we talk about SES, we're talking about socioeconomic status, right? Do you have the same kind of household wealth or financial background as the folks on your list? So take a moment and kind of do some of that comparison across your list. And start to see where are your similarities, where there's some differences. And then I'd be interested in hearing kind of what, if anything, you're noticing. And you can feel free to throw that in the chat or you can come off mute. But what are you noticing?
So I'm seeing more the socioeconomic is where the consistency seems to be for me across the board. Everything else is kind of hit or miss. And the language, I only have 2 of the people that have a second language or spoke a different language, not English first. But those are the 2 kind of the areas where I think is the most commonality in my group. But the yeah, I wouldn't have thought about that one, but so I'm glad that's on the list. Thank you.
Sure. And so Andrea, I'm wondering, are there similar areas where you've met these individuals, or do they come from different stages and parts of your, whether it's professional, personal, civic organizations?
It's actually across the board. Some are from someone I met in 3rd grade to someone I met recently. And my husband was in the military, so we moved around quite a bit. So I have a broad groups in different areas that I've learned, met over the course of my life.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a sharing
that. Yeah, no, I think that's really important, right? When we look at how our social circles get structured and who we have the opportunity to engage with, recognizing where those relationships formed or at what point in our life is a really big part of that. So thanks for sharing those. Other folks, are you seeing similar patterns of difference, or are you perhaps seeing some areas where you've got some commonalities with folks?
This is Paul Kervan.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. Well, there's one person who's essentially the same age as me, and then the others are younger than me, but within about 10 to 12 years. No differences in race. I really don't know what anybody's religion is.
Sure.
We're about evenly split male and female in terms of gender. I guess sexual identity, I guess it's male or female, and then language, we all speak English. Ability, status, we're all in the same profession, if you will, and have been, and I've known these people for at least 10 years, each of them. And I don't really know what their political ideology is, and we're probably all about within 10% of each other on the socioeconomic status. So I guess the message there is I guess I professionally I associate with people of my own kind.
Right. Well, and certainly not uncommon. I appreciate that you mentioned the fact that these are folks you've known for 10 years, right? Or longer. When we talk about developing those circles of trust, the length of time that we have to be able to engage with folks also really speaks to the ability to be able to develop that trust. And so, you are going to see some of those similarities kind of extend over time, just based on the fact that we are in shared space, right? If I'm in an industry or an environment or the part of my work where the folks are very similar to me, that's going to persist in something like, talking about particularly if we're looking at circles of trust in our professional settings. Thanks for sharing that, Paul. Let me give a second if there's maybe one other person that wants to jump in. So I've heard from Andrea, and is it Andrea or Andrea?
It's Andrea, but anything's fine.
No, I want to make sure that I get that right. With a name like Charlion, I owe it to folks to make sure that I pronounce their name correctly. But so Andrea's perspectives or experiences are, folks coming from a variety of backgrounds. Paul's got a group of folks that he's looking at that he's known for 10 years in professional settings, and wondering maybe from one other person what you're looking at when you do that.
This is Big Curly. I can chime in.
Sure, thanks.
Although I won't sound much different than Paul, I believe a lot of my inner social circles are built around professional relationships that have expanded beyond the realm of work. But as far as just going through the chart, I would say that I wouldn't necessarily say age, because the majority of people that are my peers and colleagues are a little older than I am. I would say by not by much, but by in the 5 to 10 year range. Race, I would say not so much, because all the, I would say the majority, white, Hispanic, Black would be probably the smallest number, just probably because it's representative of the makeup of my profession. And then religion, as Paul mentioned, don't really talk too much about religion in our groups. Then the gender identity, male female mix, sexual identity. I would say, again, male female, depending on how you're looking at that. I would say, male female mix, and then as far as language, English and Spanish seem to be the common languages of my inner circle, I would say. And then ability status, again, like Paul said, we're approximately the same socioeconomic status. And political ideology, well, we are. We might have similar beliefs, but we are governed by the Hatch Act, so we don't talk too much about politics. And then SES, you're gonna have to remind me again, what does SES stand for? Social economic status?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. So yeah, again, we're the same.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Vic. It's interesting, as many times as I've done this, religion comes up as one of those unknowns for so many folks, right? And it's something that for so many folks is a really core part of their identity, but yet still isn't something that we always talk about, right? And so just interesting in how, not just for religion, but how lots of these things that have shaped kind of who we are, whether by choice, because I've chosen to embrace that as a part of my identity, or because somebody has force that identity on me because of the way that I phenotypically or physically show up in the world. They've kind of defined who they think I am, right? But the extent to which those things rise to the level of prominence in how we engage with folks. But so, thinking through these lists and what you notice, right? So we talked about some of those similarities and areas where you might be more alike or more dissimilar from folks. Thinking then about how this translates into constructs like implicit or unconscious bias. Let's kind of move that forward just a little bit, right? And I'll circle back to kind of bring that loop closed in just a second. So implicit bias or unconscious bias, you'll hear me kind of vacillate between the two, essentially mean very similar things. They're the natural preferences that are imprinted through experiences, patterns, and associations that we've learned, right? And so if our patterns and experiences are shaped by people who are very similar to us, right, who make up that circle of trust, who are the folks that we tend to go to, right, how does that reinforce patterns or experiences that we're exposed to? We also have these associations, and here's where I want to take the moment to distinguish between the unconscious and the conscious, right? So the unconscious associations are the things that we can recall really quickly without a whole lot of thought or effort. So using the chat box, do me a favor, and I want you to type in the first word or phrase that comes to mind when you think of the word summer. What's the first thing that you think of? Right, these are like those word association games my mother used to use with us while we were taking road trips, right? So I'm seeing some folks say sun and beach, the heat, definitely missing some of that right now if you're in Pennsylvania. It's Janet's favorite season, I don't blame you, right? Boating, all of the things that I wish I could be doing right now, right? So looking at this list that's come in so far, not really seeing anything that stands out as something where I'm like, I don't really understand that. I don't understand how that connects with summer, right? That's because these unconscious associations are really easy to jog and they don't take a whole lot of effort because it's something that has been, again, going back to those patterns and experiences that most of us can be familiar with, whether personally experienced or tangentially, right? Whether it's because we've seen other folks doing it or it's been portrayed for us in literature or the arts or other kind of visual media or even music might be places where we would see or experience those things. The conscious stuff is a little bit different, right? So you say the word summer and I tell you the first thing that comes to mind is construction, right? Now, see, Lauren, I don't know if you saw her window here. Lauren started laughing immediately, right? Well, if you live in Center County or are near University Park during the summer, you know that as soon as the students leave campus, the blue fences go up, Atherton Street, College Avenue shut down, construction is full force, right? That's what our summer is. It's dealing with construction. That's a little bit more of a conscious, right? There's a story behind that. There's something that either I know the story to it, or people who are close to me in whether it's relationship or geographic region, but it's a little bit more specific, right? But then there's a deeper layer of conscious bias or conscious association. And so, for example, if you were to say, well, Charleon, what do you think of? What comes to mind for you when you hear the word summer? I'm going to tell you, I almost immediately think of tuna macaroni salad, right? And here's where you're going to look at me like, there's got to be a story behind that, right? So yes, every summer we would drive to visit my grandmother, and it didn't matter what time. Oh, Dale, we're going to have to work on that one. I'm traumatized. We would go visit my grandmother. It could be 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Nana had made a big bowl of tuna macaroni salad, heavy on the noodles, heavy on the tuna, no salt, very little mayo, paprika on top, but that was it, right? Dry, cold, like I can feel it stuck in my throat. But you could not eat it. If you didn't eat it, you were entitled, you were selfish, you were ungrateful, right? So we had to eat this. Unfortunately, my grandmother lived a very full life, but passed away back in 2006. And since that time, no one in our family has made or eaten tuna macaroni salad, right? Here's the difference. Unconscious bias are the things that once we are aware that we quickly make that association, the awareness that that association is there can help us to undo that association, right? Having that awareness. Here, conscious bias, I know that I have a bias against tuna macaroni salad. I then have to have the choice and the motivation to want to undo that bias. That's the difference between unconscious and conscious. There might be areas where you have a very strong conscious bias, and you're going to have to do the work to dig into that and find the motivation to undo it. The conscious stuff, though, is the stuff that once we start to pay attention and become aware that the biases might exist, we have a much easier time undoing them. Not entirely simple, but certainly have an easier time being able to undo them. From a definitionary standpoint, unconscious bias was research that was founded in the late 90s by these three individuals, right? Tony Greenwald, Mazaran Banaji, and Brian Nosek. Most often now, when you hear, whether it's on NPR or some other podcasts, you'll hear from Mazaran, right? She's the primary author of the book Blind Spots, The Hidden Bias of Good People. A really, really great book if you have a chance to take a look at it. It is written from an academic standpoint, I'll say that. So lots of good research there. More recently, in the early 2010s, Bethany Teachman and some others at UVA and Harvard started looking at implicit bias as it relates to mental health. But what they did was they did research about the associations that people make about identifying characteristics of otherness, right? So when we go back to those demographic boxes that we were checking for our trusted 10, where people are different, right? And usually when we talk about otherness, we're talking about different in category, meaning they are in a minoritized identity category. And look at how people, so their research looked at how did people make judgments without intention about those groups. If you haven't already, I would really encourage you to take an implicit bias test. And you can do that at projectimplicit.net. They have about maybe 12 or so implicit association tests, unconscious bias tests that you can take. And what the test does is it gives you some visual cues. I'm pretty sure that they have made some adaptations to it at this point for various types of accessibility for folks where vision might not be the way in which they can access the material. But what they'll have you do is respond to the stimulus they've shown you, and they want you to respond as quickly as possible. And they start to vary up the stimuli in different orders and see how you can pair information. What that showed is various levels of implicit or unconscious association. It's possible to have no implicit association or unconscious bias. It's possible to have slight. And when they talk about these preferences, what they mean is not that you have a preference for people, but that you found it easier to pair associations, right? So you found it easier to pair summer and beach than you found it easier to pair summer and leaves, right? That's where they're talking about that preference. Like it was easier to do this than it was to do that, right? So they have this scale in which those results can show up. But so what do these results mean about us, right? So let's say that and let me pause for a second and back up. What they looked at in their original test was how do people make assumptions about goodness, right? Virtue, value of people on the basis of race. And what they found was that it was easier for people to associate white people as good and Black people as bad than the opposite. It was harder for folks to associate Black people as being good and white people being bad. And they had millions of people taking these tests. And so regardless of demographic background, they saw the same results, right? So does this make us all racist, right? And that's a whole other webinar, right? We could spend another 2 or 3 webinars talking about the concept of racism, anti-racism, a lot of Dr. Kindy's work and so forth. But here's what they're talking about when we look at these concepts of implicit or unconscious bias. Bias in and of itself does not automatically equate with the labels that we've defined as being racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, so forth, right? Now, systems of sexism, heteronormativism, racism, those things exist outside of kind of personal experience with this concept of unconscious bias. But the labels that we've used for people to define somebody as being a racist or sexist or so forth is not necessarily indicated in the results of the implicit association test. What it does tell us is that there's been a potential for some unconscious messaging or associations to be present. And I'm going to show you how that works in just a second here. One of the other key pieces that folks have to understand is that it's possible to hold bias against a group that you identify with. So for example, several years ago, we were going through a series of snowstorms in Pennsylvania, right? Not uncommon to probably what's happening in Pennsylvania right now. And, but at that point, everybody was traveling to get to work, kids to go to school, so forth. And so I was getting phone calls from the folks that worked in my office to say, hey, I can't make it in today. The kids are out. I got to stay home with the kids, so forth. When the young woman in my office would call or text with this update, my response to her was always, hey, don't worry about it. Stay home, be safe, take care of your daughter. I'll see you tomorrow. When the young man in my office called or texted with the same request, my response to him, okay, don't worry about it. Stay home with the girls. I'll see you tomorrow. Be safe, right? Same words, much different message, right? And again, as somebody who's been doing DE&I work for 19 years, try to think of myself as somebody who doesn't hold these kind of gender stereotypes about women staying home with the kids and men going to work. But yet, if I look through the experiences and the folks in my trusted 10 and the patterns that play out in that, then absolutely, right, I can see that pattern. But this is what makes implicit bias so tricky and why we so often dismiss its impact. Because I can logically explain away why I had the reactions that I had that have nothing to do with gender, have nothing to do with implicit bias. I can tell you with clear conscience that the reason it was so much easier for me to not be stressed when the young woman in my office had to be absent was because her work didn't fall back on me. It didn't change my day. I certainly missed having her around, but it didn't change my day. When the young man in my office was out, well, now my day just got a whole lot harder because the things that were on his calendar now have to fit onto my calendar on top of what I already have. And that was my frustration, right? Nothing to do with gender. But when it came time to do performance evaluation, whose dedication, priority, and loyalty do you think I judged more harshly? Right? This is where those factors start to show up, right? I start to look more critically at him because he's not behaving the way that I expected him to. I look at my father, who was an elementary school principal for decades, retired after working 30 years in Northern Virginia as an elementary school principal. And when he retired, he had 3 years worth of sick days that they added on to the end of his length of service, because the man never took a sick day, right? So the experiences that I have of, you're a man, you go to work, you, right, that's your job and your role, your responsibility, have infiltrated their way in which the way in which I then navigate the world. If I pretend that doesn't exist, I run the risk of treating somebody differently, unfairly, and unjustly because of my own inability to recognize that I'm using information that I'm not actively recalling, but it's there. So let me show you how this works. You can keep your mics on mute and use the chat function for this again. But I want you to say out loud the following word, and I'm going to ask you to say it 5 times, right? So I want you to say the word folk, F-O-L-K, 5 times. You ready? Folk, 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 folk. What do you call the white of an egg? Type that in the chat. If you figured it out before you started typing, right? I'm seeing some of you with laughing, right? So I'm seeing the yolks come in. Vic, I see, who was that? Was that Dale who said the egg white, right? Lauren, I think you heard it before you typed it, right? You took the moment, right? How easy was it? I would guarantee everybody on this call right now knows that the white of the egg is the egg white, right? But how easy was it to get into that priming routine of just saying a word 5 times and the rhyming association led you to answer in a way that was counter to what you actually believe? That's how implicit bias works. When we're moving quickly, when we're not being attentive, we can call on information that we don't realize we're calling on to surface an answer we don't actually intend. Certainly, if we're multitasking, right? And how often are we not? Like, even as we're here, I'm looking, okay, I've got my 1 o'clock coming up. I've got this email coming in, right? All of these things are happening. Even sometimes as we're driving, right? How horrible is it then that we don't even have those moments? We've moved into spaces where we are so inundated with information that oftentimes we're pushed to recall and do things in short order that don't give us the moment to kind of slow down and think. Dale says it was hard to write white. I kept questioning whether I heard right. So even questioning your own, like, am I answering what I thought I heard? So here's what I want you to do. Let's try this one more time. This time, I want you to take a moment before you respond. Think about the question that I asked and answer the question. I'm going to see if you do better than the Center County Police did when I took them through unconscious bias training several years ago. This time, I want you to say the word shop, S-H-O-P, 5 times. You ready? Shop, 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 shop. What do you do at a green light? There it is, right? And listen, if we had been in the room together, I promise you, you would have heard go or go, right? You would have heard the folks kind of catching themselves in the moment, right? But it takes that extra second. It takes that the awareness that, hey, I'm priming you. I have to fight the prime, right? Now, I want you to think about all of the ways in which we've been primed about people's identities, about their gender, about their race, about their generation, about their ability, right? All of the ways in which we have been told people who look like this are this. Even if I don't actively, consciously embrace or believe that, the more I've been shown that, the more likely it is that those associations have been set up in places that I can recall without intention. And that's what we're trying to fight, right? We're trying to fight this social priming that happens easily and without attention, right? I think back to, all the ways in which, growing up, the messages I heard were, you can be whatever you want, be a doctor, be a truck driver, be a scientist, be a teacher, you can be whatever you want. But there were very specific gender roles, right? Mom did the grocery shopping, the cooking, the sewing. Dad took out the trash, chopped the firewood, navigated with the AAA map as we were trying to drive somewhere and got lost in DC, right? It's just, those memories are strong, right? But they were still very gendered roles. And those things show up if I'm not being attentive to the fact that I have to fight that priming, right? I have to take that moment and check in with myself. And so what I'm going to do a quick jump over some slides here. So I apologize if I give anybody whiplash as I move through some stuff really quickly, but I want to make sure we have time to talk about how do you fight this, right? And so one of the key things that we have to tap into is coming out of the SEEDS model to understand and manage our biases. I'll make sure that Lauren has a copy of these slides so that you can take a look at the link that's here. But one of the things that they say that I think is so important to recognizing this is that when we demonstrate resistance to our own susceptibility to bias, paired with the unconscious nature of this cognitive bias, it creates a perfect storm in which bias is not only perpetuated, it's rarely recognized or adequately managed. So why is it so hard to do this? Well, they say in part, it's because it feels good to be right and it feels bad to be wrong. Being right activates the brain's reward circuitry, right? It's from our brains, from the region of our brain that's associated with processing happiness. And being wrong activates the regions of the brain that are associated with processing pain and negative emotion, even when there are no material consequences for being wrong. I did that yoke and folk, shop and stop, go exercise with some C-suite executives not long ago. And the level of shame and embarrassment that came up when folks got that wrong shut down the training, right? Because operating at that level, being wrong, even when there was no material consequence, still felt like I am now, I have embarrassed myself in front of the folks that I have to lead. And so we had to process through that, right? How can you expect to combat bias, right? That is wrong, that is problematic, if just dealing with the pain of being wrong is so difficult, right? So we had to, and I probably should have mentioned my background is in mental health counseling. So I sure was pulling on those skills that day. It was not what I thought I was coming in for, but we had to go there, right? We had to dig into some of that. So those are some of the real key pieces that we have to be attentive to. And so here's where I'm going to skip through the influence because I think we've done just a little bit of that and skip over that story there. But so how is this showing up in our mentoring spaces, right? How does implicit bias show up, right? Well, so there's this concept called homophily. And homophily is the tendency that we have to warm up to people that we think are like us, right? So let's go back to your trusted 10, right? How did you start to engage in relationships with those folks? When did you start to realize, is it because we share a same employment background or specific skill or kind of area of expertise? Oftentimes we rush to find the similarities that we have with folks. Certainly in our alumni experience, right? We want to talk about the things that we have strong memories about, with our beloved alma mater. So we want to talk about Penn State and the things that we share in common. But we also have to recognize that there are a number of folks whose experiences at Penn State have been very different, right? And they don't have those same signature moments, right? They didn't go to the football games. When I was a student at Penn State, Thon was a very exclusive organization. If you were not a member of the Interfraternity Council, you were not participating in Thon, right? And so my experiences with that are going to look very different than the students who came in the early to mid 2000s and now have opportunities to engage. So we can't ignore the differences, right? Differences are oftentimes really salient parts of people's identity. And more often than not, because, right, if you remember what I said about it being possible to hold bias against an identity that you carry. People are shaped in an environment where their identities have already been prescribed for them. And so the work it takes sometimes to silence that critic, to silence those negative stereotypes. And please understand, there's no such thing as a good stereotype. There's not even in the best of intentions when we're saying that, actually, I won't even do it. Even when you're associating a positively ascribed characteristic to a group of people, what you're doing is removing the individual identity of that person and allowing them to tell you what's important about who they are. So don't ignore the differences, but don't let them serve as barriers to getting to find the commonalities. And usually this is where I don't look for the shared experiences, I look for the shared emotional experience, right? So maybe we didn't do the same things or have access to the same opportunities, but we certainly all know when we were, right? When our students were more traditionally away from home, we kind of have that experience of what it was like to have to transition into a new environment, right? So hearing that, what's that like for them, right? Can we connect at that level? What's it like to be at this stage of your life when you're navigating some really big life choices and maybe have so many, I have this internship and that internship, or I could study abroad, or right? Do you remember what it felt like to be in the midst of that and how overwhelming that might be, right? Areas where you can connect. Doing that then allows you to get to know an individual and be able to kind of silence a lot of the ways in which bias can override our intentions. So how then do you mitigate, right? How do you minimize the influence of implicit bias? Well, first, you have to acknowledge the potential for the bias to exist. If you find yourself with about 19 minutes of spare time, time is not free. I've learned to stop calling it free time. It's I can spare this 20 minutes or I can't. But if you find yourself with the ability to spare 20 minutes, I would encourage you to take a look at a TED Talk. I'm going to put this in the chat. Some of you already heard of this. Whoops. As I'm typing, I am advancing slides that I didn't intend to. But it's called The Danger of a Single Story. And it's by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So let me write all of this in the chat. She is a Nigerian-born author and talks about the experiences of writing stories, fictional stories about Nigeria, and her publishers telling her, no, this isn't the story of a Nigerian family. This is the story of a Euro-descended family, right? And so what happens when you only have one story? There's only one image that's been portrayed, right? Thanks, Janet. I appreciate the endorsement there. I think that the fact that she did this probably more than 10 years ago now really speaks to its enduring truth. So really great way to kind of think about those moments when you've met someone and you're getting to know them and you're realizing, wow, that's not what I would have thought about them. Or that, right? Those are those kind of key moments when we have a chance, right? Here's the other thing, and the thing that everybody says, you should never do that, right? We're taught you don't acknowledge stereotypes. You certainly don't perpetuate them or say them out loud, but you have to start to recognize that those stereotypes exist, right? And stereotypes are the limited way in which we have prescribed a very specific piece of information to a broad group of individuals, and very rarely are they based in the truth of that individual's experience. So before dismissing a stereotype that comes to mind, right? And so, for example, anytime we have a new generation entering into the workforce, they're scapegoated with all kinds of stereotypes. I'm not going to perpetuate those by naming them, but I'm sure you can think of the way folks talked about millennials when they entered the workforce, the same way they talked about Gen X, the way we're talking about Gen Z right now, right? Those stereotypes come up. Acknowledge that that's a stereotype that exists for that group, whether I or you personally perpetuate, believe, or use that stereotype, it exists, right? And so the way that we market to people is oftentimes based off of, if not entirely based off of, stereotypes about a group, right? The way that we tell stories about groups, right? Because we want things to be relatable, we use these vast generalities that limit the individual experience of folks. And so you have to tap into that, right? So if I know that this stereotype exists, how would I respond to somebody who shows up with those characteristics? Like, would I be annoyed? Would I be less patient? Would I be less willing to kind of offer? So for example, somebody who, is showing up 5 to 10 minutes late every time you decide to meet. I was actually in a leadership development seminar not long ago, and a CEO was speaking to us and talking about how much lateness just really irks him. And just inside, I'm cringing and really struggling, because I know how much time is a factor of culture and how cultures see and value time differently. And what he was saying was, if you don't ascribe to the American ethnocentric notion of time, and being on time is late and being early is being on time, then you're being disrespectful, right? But if we don't key into that stereotype about people being late, being lazy, or not being organized, then what happens is my reaction to that can still manifest without me necessarily tapping into the things that are behind that, right? Being able to kind of challenge that stereotype. And the way that we challenge stereotypes is by looking at the individual stories, right? And being able to use an individual narrative as opposed to this broad sweeping brush of all people act this way. So confronting that means, what I want you to do, right? And we'll wrap this up and have some time here for questions. I want you to, and you don't have to put this in the chat, this is for your own personal notes. I want you to think of and write down one bias that you'd like to reconstruct. Even if it's one that you think, I don't operate this way. I don't treat women different than I treat men or folks who are non-binary. I don't treat folks who are able-bodied differently than I treat those who have differing or diverse physical abilities, right? What's the one bias you'd like to reconstruct? And then I want you to give some thought into what's getting in the way of being able to actually reconstruct that bias, right? If you know the bias is there, why hasn't that been able to shift? Why hasn't that bias gone away for you? And so then the next part is, what's critical for you personally to have to address in order to disrupt the biased association? And sometimes this means, well, I have to learn more about a group that I don't get to interact with very much, because, right, when we go back to this concept of homophily, if I'm surrounding myself, or am just because of the way that structures are designed and situated, I end up being around people. When I think of the way neighborhoods are designed, when I think of the way schools were originally drawn up by geographic region or content matter, right? Oftentimes we can find ourselves pushed into these more homogenous groups because of just the way the structures and the systems have been designed. So how then do I break out of that and get to know the folks, or the areas where I need to challenge a bias? How do I start to do that? What would be the impact if you don't tackle the bias? And oftentimes that becomes the driver, right? Here's what I lose out on. Here's what I miss. Here's the things that fall through the cracks, whether it's in a working relationship, a mentoring relationship, a cordial kind of neighborhood or personal relationship. Who's it going to impact, and how bad could it get, right? Those are the things that will undergird your ability to be able to move forward, right? They become your drivers to then set a goal to be able to deconstruct this, right? So if you've been able to identify what that bias is, how do you set a goal to deconstruct it? Well, you set a goal by starting to think, if you knew you wouldn't fail, what would you do, or how would you start? I am a proud introvert. I will tell anyone I meet, I am A1 introvert. I recharge by having time alone to think, process, kind of go through, pull apart, and do that introspection. And yet I know that in order to broaden my perspectives, right, to hopefully reach a point where I can do a trusted 10 exercise in the way that Andrea did, that I start to see lots more differences in the people that are closest to me than what my actual trusted circle looks like right now, right? That means I have to get outside of my comfort zone and start to get to know people who are different from me, right? And so that one specific step, how am I going to do that, right? What's the one next thing? Is there one individual that you can invite to coffee? Is there one YouTube or book or article or documentary you can take a look at? What's one specific step you can take in the next week? And how will you know when you've done it, right? Maybe it is, I'll know that I've finished the documentary because, right, I'm at the end, or we got the coffee chat scheduled, or, you know, we met up on Zoom for, right, hopefully this won't be enduring for much longer, right, but have a chance to actually get engaged. Oh, I'm so sorry. Thanks for that note about my upcoming calendar conflicts. I'm so sorry that that was in the way there. But so yeah, what's the one specific step you could take in the next week, and how are you going to know that you've done it? You want to throw a little added challenge on top of this. Who are you going to tell about this goal? Who are you going to tell that can then hold you accountable to it, to say, hey, did you ever actually get a chance to doing this, right? Those are the things that I want to encourage you to think about. One, recognizing that the bias exists, and two, doing the work to learn it differently, right? Unlearn where the bias is coming from, to then be able to relearn in a new way the truth about the individuality of the folks that you'll be introduced to in any number of different encounters with individuals. So that being said, let me turn it over for questions or comments or anything that's lingering for you. And I want to give time for my fellow introverts to think for a little bit before typing in their questions or coming off mute.
One thing that keeps coming up in my group of friends is that we should, as we're learning these things, that we should learn them ourselves and not rely on our other folks. So like my girlfriends of color are like, don't come to me to teach you how to be a better person, how to be a better white person to Black people. Like, just I can't be the spokesperson for everybody, right? So that's a conversation we have on a regular basis, is how do we learn to get over these biases without putting the onus on someone else, right, to teach us. That's kind of the conversation we've had over the last couple of years, just internal to our own families, and also like within our friend group, is how do we learn without making work for other people.
Putting that right. Yeah, no, that's such an important point that you bring up, Andrea. So thank you for sharing that, right? Because oftentimes in our attempt to learn more about folks, we're going to the folks who are already bearing the burden of the marginalization, the oppression, that kind of systemic issue that has in lots of ways minoritized folks, to then have the responsibility to also be the educator, right? So giving them kind of that dual role or responsibility. And so that is a really important part to consider. And so this is where start doing some, right? There are any number of books that are written by folks who own the identity and experience, right? Going back to kind of these structural issues. So much of what we've been taught or has been presented to us has been written by a group of folks who don't have the lived experience that they're writing about, right? As I think back, man, this had to be 20 years or so ago, but still persists in lots of ways. There was a huge wave in K through 12 education where school districts outside of the state of Texas were picking the same textbooks that Texas was using, because if Texas was ordering the school book in mass, it was cheaper to join in on that mass purchase than it was to go with, right, another textbook altogether. And if you know anything about the way Texas has handled the teaching of American history in the K through 12 setting, you'll know that they've taken a very strong creative license in talking about the contributions and experiences of Native, Indigenous, Black, and other folks of color. So if that then becomes the prevailing education that we're learning, unlearning that then has to also become our responsibility, and we can't put that responsibility squarely on the folks who've lived that experience. So finding authors who have the identity, have the lived experience, reading that, not to necessarily agree with what they're saying, but reading to understand their lived experiences, right? And then using that to build information or knowledge. I have found that when people come to me and say, hey, I was reading something about this and this and this, and want to get your insight as a woman of color on, it's much easier for me to engage in that conversation than it is for me to feel like we got to go all the way back to square one with you. Right. So thank you, Andrea. Really, really appreciate you mentioning that. I think most folks would appreciate hearing that people are doing some work to learn and engage their own knowledge base, or broaden it at least. Any other comments or questions? They say it takes the average introvert 7 seconds to speak up. So usually I'm counting to 7, right? Sometimes 14 for those above average introverts. You're welcome. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Dale. Much appreciated that. Thanks again. Yes, really, really appreciated having a chance. Lauren, thanks to you and your team for the invitation. Really glad I had a chance to join you all today. Hope that everyone is doing well and continues to take good care, and hope to have a chance to connect again in the future. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Charlian, for this wonderful presentation. I know I was taking notes as you were speaking as well. And for all of those who are here, the recording will be made available through our newsletter next week. But also, Charlian, if you wouldn't mind sending over those PowerPoint slides, I can send them out directly to all of you so you have those resources. But yeah, I can't say enough thank you. This was excellent. I feel like we could have even more conversations about this, which we probably will going on in the future. But for next month, for those who are here, our spring webinar series is going to focus on the state of the mentor program. And Ellen Conkle and I will be going over some of the upcoming changes that will be taking place over the summer, as well as feedback that we've received in our past surveys, which will be exciting. So I hope you all can join us, and that'll be on March 31st at noon. So thank you again, Charlian, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Take good care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.